Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about experiments, which is a research method that's not that commonly used within sociology, but still sometimes used, and still, a useful method to know about. Okay, so let me share the screen. Okay, so experiments. So the essential idea of experiment that makes it different from other research methods is that you're not just going to be observing the social world, but you're going to be manipulating it, right? That you're going to do something to the social world and then see what effect that has, right? This is what's sometimes called as a stimulus, right? So you're going to stimulate or do something to affect the world and then see what effect that has on society or on people, and then that helps you make your argument. Okay, so in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about a few different things. We're going to talk firstly about the classic experiment, right? So how this is kind of the gold standard of experiments, how classically you're supposed to be run an experiment, and then give example of a classic experiment within social psychology. It's one that's kind of gets pretty close to sociology. Then talk about issues of validity. So this is essentially some of the problems that experiments can have. And then talk about natural experiments and field experiments, which is similar to your reading today. And then we're going to end by talking about the reading, racial discrimination in the sharing economy, evidence from a field experiment. Okay, so let's first start talking about the classic experiment. This is, in some sense, the gold standard, how you're supposed to run an experiment to get, the best results. Okay, so I'm going to show a picture in a little bit, but first let me talk about some of the main elements of a classic experiment. So the first main element is that you have two groups. You have a control group and an experimental group, right? And so you're going to assign your research subjects to one of these two groups. And essentially the difference is that the experimental group is the only group that gets a stimulus, right? Your stimulus is the thing that you're manipulating, right? The thing that you're doing to people or to society to see what effect it has. And so basically you have a control group, which gets nothing happens to them. And then you get an experimental group, right? Experimental group in which something does happen. And so basically, in some sense, what a experiment is doing is comparing those two groups, right? You're comparing a control group, which is, nothing happens. So they kind of, they just maintain like a base level or normal level. And then you're going to get an experimental group. And basically what you want to do is, how does getting a stimulus affect the experimental group and make it different from the control group, right? And so in some sense, what you're doing is you're seeing the difference between the control group and the experimental group that gets the stimulus, right? That's the thing that you're going to manipulate. And this might become clearer in a little bit when I talk about the example. And so one basic question is, well, how do you pick who gets into the control group and who gets into the experimental group? And this is a really important question. It's a little bit similar to sampling, but different. And basically, essentially what you want to do is you want to make your control group and your experimental group the same or as similar as possible, right? You want to make sure that it's the stimulus that's affecting the experimental group, not that they are in some way already unique and different. And so what you hope for, what you're trying to do in an experiment, is you're trying to make your control group and your experimental group the same, right? Or as similar as possible, right? They should be, in some sense, be interchangeable. Now, there's two ways you can do this, right? And again, I guess this is the way that's maybe a little bit similar to sampling. So one way is just random selection. right? So in this way, you have a group of people, let's say like 20 people, and you just randomly select each person to be in the control group or experimental group. You just let chance decide, right? And the idea here is if you're not purposely putting one group of people into the control group and another into the experimental group, if you're just letting chance or randomness decide, then the two groups will be similar to one another, right? You're just kind of randomly letting chance decide, and it'll just be similar. Right, that's one way. Random selection, just let chance decide, and that way you're letting go, and then you hope and that the two groups will just be similar. The second way you can do it is what's called matching, right? And this is a little bit like quota sampling, if we can remember that. And so in matching, basically what you're doing is you're forcing the two groups to be similar, right? So you say, okay, you have 20 subjects, 10 are men, 10 are women. And so you're going to make sure that 5 women go in a control group and 5 women go in an experimental group. You're going to make sure that 5 men go in a control group and 5 men go in the experimental group. You're going to make sure that they have an even number of age groups. They're similar in age, they're similar in race, right? You look at all the social characteristics that you think are relevant, and you ensure that they match, that the control group and the experimental group are similar to one another. And so in some sense, it's a different technique. Now you're forcing sameness, right? Rather than just guessing or just letting chance decide which one will be in the control group or experimental group, you're just forcing it to be the same. And so it's really two different techniques. Random selection is just letting chance decide who goes where, and just leaving it out of your hands, not taking control. Whereas matching is you're doing a lot of control and you're forcing the two groups to be the same. What I will say though is that now most experiments are run by random selection, right? That a lot of research has showed that random selection is actually a better way to do it than matching. And so it's better just to let go and let chance decide. Okay, so that's the first part, right? So summarize, we have a control group in which nothing is done, and then you have an experimental group which gets the stimulus, gets the thing that is you're doing to society, that you're manipulating. And basically what you're going to do in an experiment is you're going to see how the experimental group is different from the control group. What effect did the stimulus have on the experimental group, right? And ideally, the two groups should be in all other ways similar, right? It should be the stimulus that's actually making them different. Okay, that's the first part. Second is we can talk about this idea of what's called pre-tests and post-tests, right? So you want to ensure that the stimulus is having some effect. Well, how do you figure that out? How do you figure out if the stimulus, the thing that you're doing, is having an effect on the experimental group? Well, you got to test them. And so what you're going to do is you're going to give both groups, the control group and an experimental group, a pre-test, right? You're going to test them in some way before the stimulus, right? So you test them once. That's called a pre-test, right? Before anything happens. Okay, I think I got disconnected, but I'm back on. Okay, so I was talking about a pre-test and post-test. Let me share the screen again. Okay. All right, we're back. Sorry, talking about the pre-test and post-test. Okay, let me back up. Okay, so you have a pre-test, right? You're going to test both the control group and the experimental group before the stimulus, or you're going to take some measure of them, right? Then what's going to happen is the experimental group is going to get a stimulus. You're going to do something to them, right? The control group, nothing's going to get done to them. And then you're going to do a post-test, right? Now you're going to test both groups again, right? So you're going to give them the same test, actually, right? So you're going to give them the test once more. And basically now what you're going to see is there a change for the experimental group? Is there a change from the pre-test to the post-test? Okay, let's try to see this all happening with a nice little picture. All right, so here's a classic experimental design we have here. I'm going to try to kind of describe it a little bit. Okay, so let's start on the left-hand side, right? So what we have is we have an experimental group, right? They're going to get the event or the stimulus. Then we're going to have a control group. They get nothing, right? Nothing happens to them. And so then the experimental group and the control group, they both get a pre-test. We get some measure from them, right? Then the experimental group gets the event or the stimulus. Then we test both groups again, right? They get a post-test, each one. Okay, so what this means then essentially is that there's two comparisons going on. We're looking at two things, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the change in the pre-test to the post-test in the experimental group. Let me go back. All right, so here's the experimental group up top. They get a pre-test, they get some stimulus, and then they get a post-test. So if the stimulus did something, if it had some effect on these people, then the post-test should be different from the pre-test. There should be some level of effect that is there, that's evident in the post-test, right? Something's done to them, and so then that shows up in the post-test. So the first comparison is the difference between the pre-test and the post-test for the experimental group, right? The pre-test and the post-test for the control group should be the same because nothing happened to them. All right, so that's the first comparison, right? Is there a change in the pre-test to the post-test in the experimental group that got the stimulus? If the stimulus is having effect, there should be a change. Okay. Second is now you're going to test the control group and the experimental group. You're going to test their post-tests, right? So now you got two groups. You got your control group and you got your experimental group, and you got two post-tests, right? If the stimulus had some effect, if it did something, then the two groups should be different, right? Only the experimental group got the stimulus, and so the experimental group should be different from the control group because it got that thing. It got manipulated in some way, right? And so their post-tests should be different from one another, right? So this is a classic experiment, right? It's really saying that what we're going to do is we're going to see what effect a stimulus has. We're going to do something to people, and when we're going to see what effect that has on people, right? And then that's why we're going to be able to figure something out about society and people, right? And where two comparisons then are, from pre-test to post-test in the experimental group, and then in the post-tests of the control group and experimental group. I understand this is a bit complicated, and hopefully, the example I'm going to shortly explain should make it a little bit clearer. Okay, so let's see an example. So there is a social psychologist. So social psychologists are very similar to sociologists. There is a big overlap in that field of social psychology and sociology. Right? Basically, social psychologists want to understand how society is affecting the mental and cognitive behavior of humans. Right? How is society affecting what people think and what they do in the end? So Robert Nisbet, who's a social psychologist, well known, he had this kind of interesting question. Right? What he found was that the rates of violence are higher in the South, right? So in the southern United States, like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, right? There's higher rates of violence than in other parts of the country, say in the Northeast, in the Southwest, in the Northwest. And so the question becomes why, right? What's unique about the South that gives them a higher rate of violence, right? Assaults, armed conflicts, gun violence. So Nisbet comes up with this theory, right? He says it's a culture of honor. So he says that Southerners are particularly concerned about their reputation, right? Their status in the world, right? There's a lot, there's this huge concern over status. And so that can easily cause a violent conflict. So basically, if you offend somebody, if you disrespect them, right, you cause them to be ashamed, right, then that is a huge deal for a Southerner. Right? They have this culture of honor, that's very important to them. And so if you offend their honor, if you're disrespecting them, then that makes Southerners, and particularly Southern men, particularly open to use violence to redress that shameful event, to get back their honor, right? And so this idea that it's something happening inside the heads of Southerners, like that they have this culture, this way of thinking about themselves and their honor that's causing them to be more, focused on their status, which can then therefore make them more violent. Okay, so what did Nisbet do? So Nisbet said, okay, I want to test this theory through conducting a classic experiment. Right? So he had a control group, and he had experimental groups, and he had a stimulus. So let me describe how this experiment happened. Okay, so he had two groups of people. He had 62 Southern students, right? So students from a Southern university. And then he had 111 Northern students who were attending University of Michigan, right? So he had these two groups of people, right? He had students, university students who were living in the South, and university students who were living in the North, right? And then so you got two groups, group of 62 in the South, 111 in the North. Then he divided those two groups up into a control group and experimental group. So you actually got four groups, right? You got a control group for the Northern students, a control group for the Southern students, experimental group for the Northern students, and experimental group for the Southern students. Okay, so what does he do? Okay, so he first does a pretest. So he has all the students get their saliva tested in a lab, right? He's going to test them for two things, cortisol and testosterone. So cortisol is a physiological measure of somebody's level of stress and anxiety. And testosterone is a hormone that is connected to a person's aggression, right? So more testosterone in your body at any moment, you're more aggressive you're likely to be. Okay, so all the students, they get a pretest, test their level of cortisol and test their level of testosterone in their bodies, and they're all men. Right? Okay, then the control group, nothing happens to them. They go down the hall and they deliver their results, and then they get tested again. They get a post-test, right? So they get the same test twice, but nothing happens to them. The experimental group, something happens to them. Okay? In the experimental group, what happens is they walk down the hall and somebody rudely bumps into them, right? This is the stimulus, right? An actor, somebody who's paid by the experimenters, intentionally bumps into the student, like bumps into their shoulder, right? And then says, watch it, right, to the student. So it says something rude to the student, right? So the experimental group, that's their stimulus. They get their honor offended, right? They get into a small conflict, right? Somebody bumps into them and they get, offended, right? And the person says something rude to them, like, watch it, buddy, right? So we have two groups then, right? We got the Northerners and we got the Southerners. And we got control group and experimental group for each set of Southerners and Northerners. One group, the control group, nothing happens to them. Experimental group gets a stimulus of somebody bumping into them. Now, what Nisbet wants to know is, do the Southern students react more to this stimulus, right? Do they get more aggressive? Do their cortisol levels and testosterone levels shoot up higher because they're Southern. So so they get tested again. That's the post-test. So what's the results? Right, so it's the classic design. You get a pre-test, right? You get the event of somebody getting bumped into, and then you get a post-test. So the pre-test is the level of cortisol and testosterone. The event stimulus is getting rudely bumped into for the experimental group. And then post-test is you get another second test of cortisol and testosterone. What's the results? So what we see is that this bet was proven right? So for when the Southern students get insulted, when they get rudely bumped into, their cortisol level shoots up. But for the Northern students, it doesn't actually, right? So the control group stays the same, but for both, right? But for the Southern students, their cortisol level shoots up, right? Meaning that they're more pumped up, they're more stressed, they're more anxious, right? Because they're Southern. What about testosterone, right? They get insulted again, both Southern and Northern students, but the Southern students now get more of a testosterone kick, right? They get their testosterone levels jump up. And so what Nisbet argues is that this proves the theory correct, right? He says, look, Southerners are more prone to being offended. And we can see this in this experiment in which after they get bumped and rudely talked to, their cortisol and testosterone jumps up more than the Southerners, right? But it shows you, how you can test the social theory with an experiment. Okay, so that's the idea of a classic experiment, with all those elements. Now let me talk about some of the problems with experiments. What some of the issues that experimenters deal with. So there's two problems. Problems with internal validity and then problems with external validity. So let me talk about them one by one. Okay, what's internal validity? So internal validity is the question of, does your experiment, is it truly reflect what's going on in the experiment? Basically, did something get messed up in your experiment? Is there something internal to the experiment that messes up your results? Okay, and so what could mess up your results? Right? What could be some problems with internal validity? So one problem is simply testing people. So by giving people a pre-test, you can actually, get them thinking about, alter them. That in some way, the pre-test is its own stimulus, right? And so testing people can mess them up. What else? Selection bias. Selection bias means that there's a difference between the control group and the experimental group, right? That the two groups are not the same. And so the problem here is it's not really the stimulus that's affecting the experimental group, but it's the fact that they're already different is having an effect on them. Right? The third problem is what's called history and maturation. Right? Essentially here with history is something else happens besides the stimulus. There's some other event, right? It's some historical event, right? Something occurs on the news. There's something happens to the people, they get a bad cell phone, they get a cell phone message, right? Something happens that's not the stimulus that's affecting the experimental group, right? And then maturation is simply that, people have gotten older, right? The time has progressed and people are changing. Right? So the problem here is the longer you leave it between the pre-test and the post-test, the longer you could have something happen in between, right? So if it's just a few hours, then nothing's going to happen. But if you do a pre-test and then a stimulus and then you do a post-test like 6 months later, then there's a lot of chance for things to happen other than the stimulus, right? And so that's the problem of history and maturation. Okay, so that's internal validity, things that can mess up your experiment internally. The second problem is external validity. And this is more kind of just theoretical or conceptual. Here the problem is not that the experiment got messed up, but here the problem is, does your experiment reflect the outside world, right? Does what happens in the lab, does that accurately reflect what's going on, with people out in the world, right? And so, it's really, there's not a specific thing like testing your selection bias or something like that, but really external validity is more kind of just an abstract problem. The problem is, does the conditions of the lab, is that really reflective of how people are thinking and acting out in the world, right? And this is a problem with all experiments, because experiments are usually, they're usually done in a lab, a separate space. And so having, the question is does that experience in a lab really reflect what's going on in the outside world? And that question is a question of external validity, right? Does the lab conditions, is that reflective of the external conditions of society and of the world? Okay, how do you get around external validity? What's a way to solve external validity? Well, a way to solve external validity is what's called natural and field experiments. So these are experiments that don't happen in a lab, but actually happen out in the world, right? And so by having the experiment being run out in the world, out in society, then you get past this problem of whether the lab reflects the external world. Okay, so there's two ways you do this. There's two ways that you can run an experiment out in society. The first is a natural experiment. Okay, so what's a natural experiment? So a natural experiment is when, just by random chance, the world provides a stimulus, right? Something happens in the world, right, that creates a stimulus that affects some people, but not others. And so produces this naturally occurring experiment in which some people are affected and other people are not affected, right? And you didn't make it. You didn't produce the stimulus. It just kind of randomly or naturally happened. So let's see an example. Okay, let's say there's a town, right? Some town in America in the Midwest, or somewhere, actually not the Midwest because they don't get hurricanes, but somewhere, let's say in Florida, right? And let's say a hurricane comes, right? Hurricane comes and destroys some of the houses in that town. Let's say like 50% of the houses, right? So like half the people have their houses destroyed and the other half, their houses are okay, right? And so what we have here is a natural experiment. We have a situation in which a stimulus has happened, a hurricane, and that hurricane has affected one group of people, but not affected another group of people. So we naturally have an experimental group in which their houses got destroyed by a hurricane, and we have a control group in which their houses did not get destroyed. And so because of this natural event, we can now run an experiment. We can do a post-test. Right? We don't have a classic experiment. We don't have a pre-test because we didn't know the hurricane was going to happen, right? But we can do a post-test, right? So let's say we measure these two groups of people, the people who lost their houses and the people who kept their houses. Their houses were not destroyed. And we can measure them in terms of what they think about money, right? Are the people who lost their house in a hurricane, are they more careful with their money? Right? Does having a natural disaster make you more careful with your money, make you more, in some sense, more likely to save and less risky? Okay? And right, we can do this from a natural experiment, right, of the hurricane. We didn't do the stimulus, right? We're sorry that the people lost their houses, but we're taking advantage of this naturally occurring event to basically run an experiment. The world affected some people, and we're basically seeing the results of that. Right? In a similar way, we could think about coronavirus, right? We could imagine running a coronavirus experiment, see, are people who have the coronavirus, do they think about their health differently than people who don't get the coronavirus, right? And basically the coronavirus infection is the stimulus, right? Affecting some people, not some others, right? So naturally occurring experiments or natural experiments are experiments in which the stimulus naturally occurs, and then we measure, we test the people who got this natural stimulus versus people who didn't. Okay, what then is a field experiment? So a field experiment is pretty similar, right? It's an experiment that is done in the real world, right? It's not done in a lab, it's done out in society, but it's not nature who did the stimulus, it's us. Like we manipulated people, but we did it out in the world and not in a lab, right? So it's not a naturally occurring experiment because it didn't just happen randomly, the stimulus, but we made it happen, right? So what's an example of this? Example of this actually is that experiment that I described all the way on the first day of class, right? Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal, right? So these people, the researchers, they sent out resumes to people to jobs in Chicago and Boston. And the resumes were exactly the same, except for the names of the people. So half the names were typically white sounding names, and then the other half of the resumes were typically black sounding names, right? And so that's the stimulus, right? That's the change in the names is the stimulus, is the thing that the experimenters are manipulating, right? And so they want to see, does that change in names affect whether or not people get called back for a job interview, right? Is there a difference? Is there discrimination in the labor market? And can we know this by seeing whether people are more likely to call people back with white sounding names than African American sounding names? And if you remember all the way back to the first week of class, the results were that they were, right? People were 50% more likely to call back people with white sounding names, showing that race does affect people's chance of getting a job interview, right? And so this is basically, these two ways are ways to get around the problem of external validity. You're no longer running your experiment in the lab, you're running it outside of it. And so, there's no longer a question of whether or not the conditions of the lab resemble the outside world because you're not doing it in a lab. Okay, let me now end with talking a little bit about the reading. Again, because I find it to be a really interesting reading and a good example of a field experiment. So it's pretty similar actually to the reading I just described. Are Emily and Greg as employable as Jamil, as Lakeisha and Jamal, right? So what it does here is, so let me basically describe the experiment. So what the people did is they did a similar experiment, but with Airbnb. So now it's not about getting a job, but it's about short-term rental housing or being able to get a home, rent a holiday home, right? And so they did a similar thing to previous experiment, right? So what they did is they set up fake Airbnb guest profiles, right? So profiles, they filled in the little thing you have to fill in describing yourself in Airbnb, and all the profiles were exactly the same, right? The same kind of description, the same kind of blurb, right? The only thing that was different was half the people had typically white sounding names, and the other half of the people had typically African American sounding names. So you can see the names here, right? So it was male and female, right, in two groups. So white female, people like Anne Murphy, white male, Greg O'Brien, African American female, Tanisha Jackson, African American male, Tyrone Robinson, right? But all the blurbs and everything else was exactly the same, right? And so the only thing that would be different would be the people's names, right? There was no photo of the people, right? Nothing like that. And so it was only the name that gave an indication of the race of the guest. And so basically the question of the research was, are people more or less likely to rent their Airbnb house to a white American over than an African American, right? So, that's basically their question, right? Is there discrimination, racial discrimination within the market for short-term rental housing? Right? And so they put out these profiles and they contacted potential hosts with the same invitation again, asking to stay at their house. And they wanted to see if was there a difference. Did the name of the person indicating their race, did that have an effect? So what were the results? Yes, the results were there was a difference. So they had a few different, it wasn't a simple yes or no. So it was a yes, conditional yes, like, yeah, you could probably stay here. A no response being, nope, you can't stay here. A conditional no being like, no, but maybe, or sorry, no response meant they didn't say anything at all. No meaning that they said, no, you can't stay here. And so what we find, or what they found, was that white guests were more likely to get a yes response, right? Were more likely to get accepted by the host, right? And the difference was about, I think it was 42 to 50%. So 50% of the time, white hosts got accepted to stay, and 42% of the time, African-American guests got a yes answer, right? So a difference about 8%, right? So it actually, and a statistically significant difference, right? And so they break this down, right? And you can see the roll numbers here, right? Yes. Conversely, African-American guests were more likely to get a straight up no answer. What's interesting to kind of delve a little bit deeper into the results. So this is the basic answer, right? So the basic answer is there is discrimination in the short-term rental housing market, right? African Americans are more likely to get a no response. White guests are more likely to get a yes response for Airbnb, even though they're exactly the same person, same fictional person. Only difference is the person's race, right? What else is interesting is they actually looked at the race of the host, right? So now the question becomes, is it not just white hosts that are more likely to rent to white guests, but are African-American hosts also more likely to rent to white guests? And this actually I found a bit surprising in that the answer is yes, right? So it's not only that white hosts were being discriminatory against Black Americans, but also interestingly, Black Americans were also being, it seemed like, discriminatory against Black Americans, right? So African American male hosts were more likely to say no to an African American guest. And the group actually that had the smallest degree of difference was African American females, right? So, but even here we see a slight difference, right? So 43% yes for white males, 38% yes for African American males, right? But then you're actually more likely to say yes to African American females, right? But so in every situation we see, even when the hosts is a person of color, there's still discrimination happening. An interesting sociological finding. Right. So that's essentially it for today. So you see that experiments are different in that in an experiment you're not just observing the social world, but you're manipulating it. Right. This is typically done in a lab. Right, so a building somewhere, psychology building, but it's sometimes done out in the world, such as in a natural experiment or a field experiment. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you all in the next video lesson.